In the dead of a Russian winter in the 1750s, a carriage would sometimes depart from a grand estate just before dawn. Not long after, the frozen, brutalized body of a young servant girl might be found in the snow or be quietly buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. The people of rural Moscow whispered in fear, but they didn't yet know the whole truth. This was just the beginning of a reign of terror orchestrated by one of the most sadistic serial killers in Russian history. She wasn't some common criminal operating in the shadows. She was Countess Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova, a wealthy, seemingly pious, and respected noblewoman with deep connections to the Russian court. This is the haunting true story of how she turned her home into a private torture chamber, how a system of absolute power allowed her to kill with impunity for years, and how two brave men dared to expose the demon of Moscow. To understand how a noblewoman could become a monster, you first have to understand her world. 18th century Imperial Russia. It was a society of rigid, unbreakable hierarchies. At the very top sat the Empress. Beneath her were the powerful land-owning nobles who lived lives of unimaginable luxury, and at the very bottom were the serfs. Serfdom was a brutal institution that bordered on slavery. Serfs were legally tied to the land they worked, and by extension, they belonged to the owner of that land. They were, for all intents and purposes, human property, who could be bought and sold like cattle. A landowner held absolute power over their serfs' lives, and the death of a serf at the hands of their master often wasn't even considered a crime. It was into this world of unchecked power and systemic dehumanization that Darya Ivanova was born in 1730. She was the daughter of a wealthy and ancient noble family. By all accounts, she lived the life expected of a woman of her station. She was well educated, seen as devoutly religious, and known for making generous donations and long pilgrimages to holy sites. She married a captain of the prestigious Life Guards Cavalry Regiment, Gleb Saltykov, whose family held connections to the ruling Romanov dynasty. They had 2 sons, and for a time, Darya Saltykova was the very picture of a respectable aristocratic matron. Publicly, she was described as a blooming, pious woman. Nothing in her early life hinted at the darkness lurking beneath the surface. Her peers and the priests who took her donations saw only a respectable widow. But behind the closed doors of her estate, a different reality was taking shape, one built on suffering and fear. The mask of normalcy began to crack in 1755. At just 26 years old, Darya's husband died, leaving her an immensely wealthy young widow. She inherited his entire estate, which included a grand mansion in Moscow, several rural properties, and, most importantly, around 600 souls, the term used for the serfs who were now her property. For the first time in her life, there was no one above her. No husband, no father. She held absolute, unquestionable power over hundreds of lives. This power appears to have been the key that unlocked her monstrous nature. The change wasn't immediate, but about 6 months after her husband's death, a terrifying new side of her began to emerge. It started with what might have been dismissed as overly harsh discipline. A maid who hadn't washed the floor to her satisfaction might be struck with a heavy log or a rolling pin. An untimely smile could trigger a burst of rage. At first, these were isolated incidents, but soon, the beatings became more methodical, more prolonged. The reasons for her punishments became more and more trivial. A dress not laundered perfectly, a perceived look of disrespect. These were the sparks that would ignite infernos of violence. She would often have other servants begin the beatings before taking over herself, her fury escalating with every strike. What might have started as bursts of temper slowly morphed into a systematic campaign of sadistic torture. The pious, respectable noblewoman was disappearing, and in her place rose Saltychikha, a name that would become a whispered curse among the serfs of Russia. Her home was no longer a symbol of aristocratic grace. It was becoming a house of horrors. For the next 7 years, from roughly 1755 to 1762, the Saltykova estate became a private torture chamber. The Countess's sadism knew no bounds, and her imagination for cruelty was horrifyingly vast. Her primary targets were the young women and girls who worked in her house as maids and laundresses. Some historians speculate this focus was born from a bitter jealousy, as Saltykova had been spurned by a lover, a surveyor named Nikolai Tyuchov, who left her for a younger woman. Whatever the reason, Saltykova directed her most intense hatred towards the young women under her control. Her methods were brutal and varied. Victims would be flogged for hours with whips and sticks. She would pour boiling water directly onto their exposed skin. In fits of rage, she would grab them by the hair and slam their heads against the wall, or use red-hot tongs to burn their ears and faces. One of her most feared punishments was leaving her victims naked and tied to a post in the biting Russian winter until they froze to death. The psychological torment was just as severe as the physical. She seemed to take a particular pleasure in destroying the spirits of those she owned. When one male serf angered her, she had his wife tortured and killed. When he, out of necessity, remarried, she had his second wife killed, then his third. Her goal wasn't just to punish, but to utterly dominate the lives of those she considered her property. Over the years, the bodies piled up. While official court records would later convict her of 38 murders, investigators found evidence of at least 138 suspicious deaths on her properties. Most of these victims were simply reported as having died from illness or having run away. Saltykova was meticulous in covering her tracks, using her wealth and connections to bribe local officials who would dutifully ignore any complaints. Any serf brave enough to complain was often punished, flogged, and sent back to the estate, where they would inevitably disappear. 20 separate petitions were filed against her over the years, and all of them were crushed by her power and influence. She believed she was untouchable, and for years she was right. The system that enabled Saltykova's reign of terror was nearly perfect. She had wealth, noble status, and a network of corrupt officials on her payroll. For the serfs on her estate, there was no court of appeal. To speak out against their mistress was a death sentence. But even the most oppressive systems have breaking points, and the catalyst for Saltykova's downfall would come from two men who had lost everything. Their names were Savely Martynov and Yermolai Ilyin. They were two serfs on the Saltykova estate, and between them, the Countess had murdered 3 of their wives. They had seen firsthand the futility of appealing to local authorities. They knew that staying meant waiting for their own brutal end. So, in 1762, they made a decision of almost unimaginable bravery. They escaped. Their destination was St. Petersburg, the heart of the Russian Empire. Their goal was to deliver a petition directly into the hands of the one person in Russia more powerful than Countess Saltykova, the newly crowned Empress Catherine the Great. It was a perilous journey. If caught, they would have been tortured and executed. But they were driven by a grief that outweighed their fear. Their timing was perfect. Catherine the Great was an ambitious ruler, eager to present herself as an enlightened monarch. She had launched a public campaign to promote lawfulness across the empire, aiming to rein in the excesses of the nobility that she believed weakened the state. When the blood-soaked petition from Martynov and Ilyin finally landed on her desk, Catherine saw a golden opportunity. Here was a case so shocking it could serve as the perfect public example. Prosecuting a well-connected noblewoman like Saltykova for crimes against mere serfs would be a powerful statement that under her rule, not even the most privileged were above the law. She ordered a full investigation, and for the first time, the state's full attention was turned toward the horrors on the Saltykova estate. The investigation into Darya Saltykova lasted for 6 long years, from 1762 to 1768. The authorities faced an uphill battle. Saltykova refused to confess, and many potential witnesses were paralyzed with fear, terrified she would be acquitted and return to exact her revenge. Furthermore, a web of bribery and corruption had to be untangled, but as the investigation wore on, the wall of silence began to crumble. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people and meticulously examined the estate's records, finding the names of dozens of young women who had simply vanished. Slowly, a clear and undeniable picture of monstrous cruelty emerged. Out of 138 suspicious deaths investigated, the court gathered enough evidence to formally charge Saltykova with 38 counts of torture and murder. Found guilty in 1768, Saltykova presented Empress Catherine with a dilemma. Capital punishment had been abolished in Russia, and simply executing a member of the powerful Saltykov family could cause a political backlash. The punishment had to be severe, but stopped short of death. Catherine reportedly rewrote the sentence multiple times, crafting a punishment designed not just to imprison Saltykova, but to utterly destroy her as a person and a symbol. In October of 1768, Darya Saltykova was subjected to a civic execution in Moscow's Red Square. She was brought to a public platform and chained to a post for 1 hour. Around her neck hung a sign with the damning inscription, "This woman has tortured and murdered." A massive crowd gathered to stare at the face of the woman who had become a living nightmare. Following this public humiliation, she was stripped of her noble title and all her privileges. Then, she was taken to the Ivanovsky convent, not to pray, but to be imprisoned for life. Darya Saltykova was sentenced to life imprisonment in the convent's cellar. She was held in a dark cell in absolute solitary confinement, with a candle being lit only briefly when her food was delivered. After 11 years in these conditions, she was moved to another stone cell that had a small, grated window. It said her mind was completely broken by decades of solitude, and she would spend her days screaming, spitting, and cursing at people who passed by. She remained imprisoned in that convent for a total of 33 years, dying in 1801, having never shown a shred of remorse. The trial of Saltychikha was a landmark event in Russian history. It was a powerful message from Catherine the Great that the nobility's power was not absolute. It served as a stark warning to other landowners that extreme abuse would no longer be tolerated. However, while one monster was punished, the system that created her remained. The institution of serfdom, the very thing that gave Saltykova the power to torture and kill with impunity, would continue in Russia for nearly another century. The abuse of serfs didn't stop. Saltykova's case became famous not because her cruelty was unique, but because the sheer number of her victims and the public nature of the trial were so extreme. She wasn't an anomaly. She was the most grotesque symptom of a diseased system. Her story forces us to ask a terrifying question. Was Darya Saltykova a singular monster born of madness, or was she the inevitable product of a world where some lives were considered worthless and absolute power was allowed to fester without consequence? The darkest stories in history are often the most important. They reveal the chilling realities of power and the incredible resilience of those who fight for justice. If you feel compelled to look into the shadows with us, consider subscribing for more tales of power, corruption, and the enduring struggle of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and stay spooky.